Colin, you can go.
Welcome everyone on behalf of the Society of Chartered Surveyors in Ireland to this morning's conference entitled Key National and International Issues in Construction Cost Management. My name is Colin Cleary and I'll be the chair for today's proceedings. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a quantity surveying advisor with the Health Service Executive. In this role, I'm responsible for providing both commercial and procurement related advice in line with public procurement guidelines and the Capital Works Management Framework, as well as the Public Spending Code. I'm also the Irish trustee for the International Construction Measurement Standards Group, and with my colleagues on the Standard Setting Committee, we are charged with promoting the use of the ICMS within the Irish construction market. Our conference this morning promises to be a very exciting, stimulating and thought-provoking session, and we've chosen experts from right across the spectrum to present and stimulate the debate. So I'd encourage all delegates to actively engage in the session by asking questions through the Q&A function, and indeed during our virtual coffee break, which will take place this morning between 11 and 10 past 11 a.m. This is your conference, so the more you put in, the more you'll get out. As well as our SCSI members, we are also joined this morning by a number of international CEEC delegates, and I would like to take this opportunity to extend a very warm welcome to you all. I would especially like to welcome the CEEC President, Agneta Skite. Jerry O'Sullivan will introduce Agneta in more detail in a few moments, but on behalf of the SCSI, you're most welcome and we look forward to hearing you speak in a few moments. We're due to wrap up this morning's session at 12:30, so my main job is to keep an eye on timings and to keep the sessions running smoothly. So without further delay, I'll now hand you over to Jerry O'Sullivan to say a few words. Jerry.
Thank you, Colin. I'm Jerry O'Sullivan. I work with Mulcahy McDonald's, and I've been a long-time volunteer with the SCSI and current delegate to the CWC and a former president of CEC. Just to give a warm welcome to all of you, and especially to our virtual visiting members from the CEC members and further afield. I'm sorry we couldn't have you here with us in person, but we are hopeful that these desperate times to have an opportunity in the near future to have you a real person meeting and allow you to enjoy the real Irish experience, hopefully next year sometime. Today's conference is a joint venture between the Society and the CEC, the Council of European Construction Economists, and focus on the role of the construction cost manager in dealing with our expanding role in the construction world as the go-to person for advice on the value of construction costs. The theme of today's conference is our role as cost advisors to address the technology revolution in combination with our social obligation to address critical issues of climate change and other major issues hitting our industry, COVID, Brexit, to name a few. Today's speakers will focus on Level 5 BIM, effective compliant cost reporting via ICMS, enhancing our skills on life cycle costing, forecasting under ICMS 2, and the sustainability agenda, our role as carbon assessors for construction projects under the future ICMS 3. Our final talks is on our role as ensuring a plain English, easily understood modern contract formats are in use for common usage in construction projects across the country. This particularly comes from the initiative of the SCSI with Engineers Ireland and the CIF to produce what we will call a modern version for the private sector of contract similar to the PwC, but not with all the I suppose the warts that the PwC contract may be perceived to have. Before handing back to Colin to introduce the speakers and presentations, I would now like to invite the CEC President, Agneta Skite, to give a brief introduction to you about the CWC and its role. A virtual welcome to you, Agneta.
Hello, everyone. My name is Agneta Skite. I would like to welcome you all to this SCSI seminar. I have been invited to tell you something about the CEC, the European Council of Construction Economists, which SCSI also is a member of. As you see, we are happy people, often meeting at different places around the world. This picture is from Prague, where we had a site visit once. This is one of the activities that we usually do. I would like to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. We're a European organization of construction economists, and we have different member organizations. We have member organizations from Denmark, from Finland, Netherlands, the UK, Ireland, of course, France, Spain, Switzerland, where I come from, Germany, from Germany, Estonia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Belgium. We have individual members because those countries don't have active associations that are specifically dealing with construction economy. So from those countries, we have individual members. We also have Canada as an associated member. They joined us recently, and we are very happy about that. They like to visit our general assemblies and our seminars because for them it's very interesting to see what's going on in Europe, and we're also very happy for their input. So yeah, we're very happy that they joined us recently as an associated member. For the moment, we also are in contact with Italy, who are also considering joining us. And we also have contact to Norway, to their organization. And of course, we're hoping that they would also like to join us in the future. This is the CEEC board. As I said, my name is Agnete Skytte. I'm the president of the CEEC. I'm originally from Denmark, but I have worked and lived in Switzerland for over 20 years. Then we have Krian Swakhoven. He is our general secretary from Holland. Then we have Georgi Spani. He is one of our vice presidents. He's an individual member from Hungary. And we have Stephen Thompson, our other vice president. He's from the UK. So that's our board. Our goals for the future is that we want to be the European knowledge hub for construction economists. We are really trying to collect knowledge on our profession and structure it in a way that people could also actually use our knowledge, and also get connected through us. Our goal is to link professionals in Europe to share relevant practice, information, experience. We also would like to promote the profession. It's not well known everywhere, but it's definitely something that we want to promote. Of course, share common knowledge, and we also promote international standards, which is a topic for your seminar today, ICMS. That's a very important project that we are also working on in the CEEC. This is from Brussels. We meet twice a year when it's possible, when we don't have Corona. We meet in a new city every 6 months to have our seminars and our general assemblies. The Friday is usually planned in a way that we have the seminar on the Friday, which is then organized by the local association who is hosting the event. And then on the Saturday, we usually have our General Assembly, which is only for our members and visitors if they have, if they wanted to join. But of course, during Corona, we have had to change things a little bit. Last time we wanted to do it in Bern, but that was not possible. So we just had the General Assembly on the Friday, and this year we are not able to go to Dublin. We would have loved that, but instead we are all meeting online. And of course, it's great that we can all take part of your seminar today. We're very looking forward to hearing all the interesting speaks and join you on that one. We have different work groups in our association. Our current projects are, of course, the ICMS, which is a very important project. Then we also have a project called Office Cost Model, where the same office building is calculated by our members. So that way we have like a European cost comparison to see how much this building would cost in different countries. That's a project that's led by Jerry Sullivan. Then we have a project called Quantity Surveyor or Construction Economists Competencies. We have noticed that not all construction economists do the same job in different countries. We all have similar jobs, but they also differ. So that's an analysis on these competencies in different European countries. Then we also have a group collecting all the cost standards in the different European countries. That group is almost finished. And then we also have a group dashboard. That's a European Economical Survey led by Justin Sullivan from the UK, which is a questionnaire that is published in a lot of different countries, actually all over the world. And of course, we're with that focusing on Europe. And that's also running. And then we have a communication group basically working on the communication of the CEEC inside and outside of the organization. Our next seminar should hopefully be able to take place in Bern in spring 21. The theme will be sustainable construction in Switzerland. That was actually what we planned to do this spring, and we hope we can all be able to meet next spring in 21 in Switzerland if everything goes well. Yes, that was all from my part. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, you are always welcome to visit our website. You have the address here, and there are also contact information. If you have any questions or queries, you are welcome to contact us anytime. Thank you very much. I wish you a very good seminar today, and I'm looking very much forward to taking part myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Agneta. An excellent presentation there and some very interesting items discussed, and no doubt we'll come back to some questions on your presentation later. Our first session today is ICMS, BIM A Government Perspective. Our speakers, Charles Mitchell and Stephen Lynham, will discuss incorporating ICMS into the Capital Works Management Framework and the works involved in incorporating BIM into capital works projects in Ireland. Charles Mitchell is a quantity surveyor with in excess of 20 years experience in the construction sector. Formerly a member of the academic staff in TU Dublin, Charles is now one of the government representatives to the ARM committee and is the SCSI Standard Setting Committee representative in the ICMS coalition. Currently, Charles is the quantity surveyor for the Construction Policy Unit of the Office of Government Procurement. Stephen Lynham is a technical advisor with the OGP and has over 35 years experience within the Irish construction industry, commencing his career on site as a general operative in the private sector, progressing into design as a civil engineer technician in the Office of Public Works, an architectural technician in the Department of Education and Skills. There, Stephen further enhanced his studies and became a civil engineer in 2007 and completed a master's degree in information communication at the Dublin Institute of Technology in 2015. Stephen moved to his new position as technical advisor for the construction contracts in the OGP in 2018, and in this role he has responsibility for developing a plan for the implementation of BIM across public works contracts and the Capital Works Management Framework. I'd now like to hand you over to Charles to start the presentation.
Okay, good morning and welcome to presentation. I'm going to start with the incorporation of ICMS into the Capital Works Management Framework here in Ireland. So the Capital Works Management Framework itself is a structure that's developed to deliver the government's objectives in relation to public sector construction procurement reform. It consists of a suite of best practice guidance, standard contracts, generic template documents that form the 4 pillars as we see here on the right-hand side of the screen. The overview of the CWMF itself brings us through all planning through to the end of the construction stages, so the project life cycle of the project. And as we look at the work of the Office of Government Procurement, you'll see that we have the responsibility of supporting the Irish construction sector when they engage with the CWMF. And this is for our public sector projects. So in Pillar 1, we have the public works contracts, and there's 11 different types. They're supported by multiple forms, ITTs, invitations to tender, forms of tender and schedules, authorised bonding business, arbitration rules, weather events, and information notes on GDPR. The second pillar, Pillar 2, is conditions of engagement, and these are for our consultancy partners. So 2 standard conditions of engagement, 6 model forms, again, more invitations to tender, the ITTs for services, forms of tenders and schedules, arbitration rules, information notes on GDPR. The third is where I'm going to concentrate most of our talk today, and that is the cost planning and control and suitability assessments. So there's 6 standard forms there for cost planning and control, 6 suitability assessment questionnaires as well. And then Pillar 4 is our guidance notes and glossaries. There's 28 guidance notes, there's 1 glossary. There's also an archive system there as well for past notes, because obviously the current notes are reflective of contracts that are due to start or have recently started, and then other contracts may depend on those notes that are within the archives. As you can see here, there's 103 documents there currently, and there's thousands of pages in these guidance notes. A brief outline here as well, CF1 through to CF11, the different forms of contracts which we have, and they cover building, civil engineering, minor works, small works, investigations, frameworks, early collaboration, and term maintenance and refurbishment. These are our standard forms of contracts, and there are mechanisms for derogations within some of the clauses here through the Government Committee for Construction Contracts. Procurement is complex. It engages clients, end users, administrators, technical professionals, the works contractors, suppliers, construction specialists, and facilities managers. We have to take into account the public spending code, the CWMF rules themselves, and government initiatives. So we have Government Construction 2020, written in 2014, a strategy for a renewed construction sector. GCC position papers of 2017, that's our BIM adoption strategy statement of intent, which my colleague Stephen will talk about in a few minutes. And the National BIM Council 2017, the roadmap to digital transition for Ireland's construction sector, 2018 to 2021. These are just a few of the documents that we have to take on board within our normal day, and we also have to be conscious of the government circulars as well and EU directives. The government policy objectives from the CWMF is that we strive to ensure cost certainty at tender award stage, better value for money, and more efficient delivery of public works projects. When we look at this from a cost planning point of view, with cost planning and control under the CWMF, we refer back to these templates that we discussed earlier on. So the standard templates are available from the OGP for various stages of the project life cycle. And I'm stressing the project life cycle because we'll discuss ICMS in a few minutes. So we look at the outline cost plan for the projects. We look at the detailed cost plan as the development of the design commences and works its way through the process. At tender stage, we have a tender cost analysis, and then we have an analysis of the outrun costs. And we're looking at it at the different review stages, or so we should. All of our templates for cost planning and budgeting are based on and prepared using the National Standard of Building Elements and Cost Control Procedures, which I'm going to refer to as the NSBE, which is how we refer to it here on a regular basis. This is a very broad overview of the National Standing of Building Elements matrix. Each of the areas that you see here, from structure, substructure, structure completions, finishes, services mainly piped and ducted, services mainly electrical, fittings and furniture, and then again into site direct costs, are all what we would class as cost headings. Here in Ireland, they're described as elements of the structure. And an element is that part of the structure that doesn't change its function irrespective of the function of the actual building itself. So the substructure is the substructure in a house, in an apartment block, in a hotel, in a school, and into larger construction projects such as, say, our National Children's Hospital or something similar. There are breakdowns within those 7 main headings that we had there, the ones that are in a dark color, and they break down, if we look at the structure, into external walls, internal walls, partitions, floors, galleries. There's a couple of reserved elements there. Looking briefly at the history, 1970 is where the need was identified for a standardization cost control process here in Ireland. That was identified not just by government, but by other stakeholders. Some of the organisations who are represented here in the room today, the SCSI, the RAI, Engineers Ireland, and the CIF, just to name a few, along with some of the larger contractors and state body organisations, Department of Education, etc. So this document came into being. 1973, there was a second edition published, taking into account international developments. And at that case, we looked at the SFB classification system, which some of our Nordic colleagues would be aware of. More recently, and I say that sparingly, in 1993, the third and the final edition of the National Standard of Building Elements was published. It acknowledged the establishment of the need for a national data bank of construction costs. Unfortunately, we still don't have this national data bank. We have numerous data banks around the country, but in relation to sharing of information, this is where we could benefit from the ICMS. So now that we've talked about the need for the sharing of data, the International Construction Cost Measurement Standard, or ICMS as it's familiarly known, is a global standard, and it does what we need. It's for benchmarking and reporting of construction project cost. It covers both the capital and the whole life costing while providing a way of presenting costs in a consistent format. That's the definition from the ICMS Coalition website. I have just underlined certain aspects which actually fall into the ethos of what we want to do here in Ireland and what we strive to do under the Capital Works Management Framework, and what we had hoped to do in all our construction projects using the National Standard of Building Elements. So in effect, ICMS is exactly what Irish public sector wants, but with the addition of being a global solution. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Given how the global market seems to get smaller every day through the use of technology and through, how can we put it, the movement of firms and individuals around the globe, I think personally it's a good thing. I think that because of the economic considerations, our large dependency on the construction activity, foreign direct investment, that international comparisons will be key. We need to be able to monitor what's happening around the globe because we have international players in our market. In our public works contracts, we have opportunities for international contractors to engage within the Irish market. And we have, through the international market, the ability for Irish contractors to engage in the international market. So I definitely think that a common mechanism for comparing costs, for benchmarking and items like that, and for controlling costs in construction is key. As well as that, our outdated system, the National Standard of Building Elements, is currently in use only in related to building works. It doesn't work within our civils contracts or marine contracts or other such items, and it doesn't have the versatility to allow us to do so. So ICMS, the SCSI had agreed back in 2015 when the trustees originally signed the coalition membership documents. They agreed to mandate, and when the second edition came out, they agreed to mandate for the use of first and second edition together. But how is that going to work? Is it through workshops, user manuals, mapping, etc.? I think it's about all three, and I think there's good information to come come from the SCSI and the working groups on that in the future. But in the public sector, where do we stand? Where Pillar 3 is our cost planning and cost reporting. We're in the process at this moment in time, myself and a number of individuals across different government departments are actually looking at our Pillar 3 and our cost reporting forms. We're looking for uniformity in those reporting forms, and we're looking at the attributes of the various sectors as outlined in ICMS and how they will help us to have that uniformity. We're looking at how we can record and report our costs, and what's the best way for us to have that database for all of our consultants and for all of our internal staff. We currently have stakeholder engagement with the members of the GCC, and that is part and parcel of that working group, but there's a larger engagement as well where we explain the stages and the review and the reform of Pillar 3. As I said, we're currently reviewing, comparing ICMS with our current cost reporting templates and where the differences are. And obviously there are differences between the National Standard Building Elements and ICMS. However, from an Irish perspective, it's favourable because there are similarities back to the origins of the SFB that I made reference to earlier on, and the National Standard Building Elements and ICMS. So the change for us is not as drastic as it could be for some of our international cousins. When we have got these templates together, we need to present that proposal to the GCC itself. We need for each of the bodies within the government who are members of the GCC to evaluate and to form a consensus in the use of our reporting templates, which will report back into the attributes tables that we have within the ICMS. We're going to have to then define the introduction period, because we are going to, by introducing these cost reporting templates and changing what we currently have, all of our external consultants who we bring in through our consultant engagement will now have to utilize these new cost reporting forms. Similar to the reintroduction of bills of quantities into our tender formats, we're going to have to look at this on a phased basis. So projects up to a particular point, and each department might have their own, might accelerate that based on how it works with their own tender programs. So whilst we will have an overall phasing, I'd see that it could be accelerated in certain areas. But why government? Why does government want to look at ICMS? Well, our public spending code, as made reference to earlier on, and reporting. We like to report on the basis of what's happening on an international basis. We like to have that comparator. But the attributes of ICMS also make us aware at a very high level the differences between projects. So this is good because it highlights that not all structures are the same. They may be within particular aspects and cost centers, but not for, say, site location or whether it's brownfield, greenfield or otherwise. But this information is not always apparent within a bill of quantities. Government needs to develop this database because next year our budget has said that we have 9 billion for capital expenditure. That's a lot of money. It's up from 7.8 this year. And as a result, the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform has agreed to be part of the pilot program with RICS and BCIS. They're operating a pilot program for international cost reporting. We've currently reported on roads projects, and I know that there's only a small group of people over in RICS working this at the moment, but they're working full time there. The Irish government is committed to the pilot, and even more recently, Irish government departments have submitted a draft attribute listing, level 1 listing, for marine projects, marine civil engineering projects, which at this moment in time isn't covered by ICMS. But the benefit of ICMS is it has a large international working group who are working towards ensuring that all sectors are covered. So when we're looking to the future, how can the introduction of ICMS add value to public works contracts? I've referred to the desire since 1993 to have a cross-departmental cost database. I believe that ICMS along with digitalization of our current systems, will actually provide and allow for the establishment of such a cost database. The pilot program will allow us initial access to global costs for comparison at varying levels. Obviously, I believe this will be a subscription-based at a later stage, and that's something that we will work on from there. Establish sectorial attributes for non-standard projects. I mentioned marine civil engineering, but when you go through and you have a look, there's mining, there's dams, there's other such areas. We don't do all of these things, but we know that they're there for the few occasions that we do. So we're not having to reinvent the wheel and try to find an ad hoc fit. There are attributes there, and we can use the methods of measurement that we've agreed to use within the within the public works sector. Again, I believe that there's a cross-pollination here with the digitalization and the establishment of cross-departmental cost database. It's something that we have to work on from our side, but I do believe that the work that we are carrying out in the OGP in relation to digitalization of supporting documents will be a benefit. And the ability and the option to expand the CWMF to include asset life cycle, so from cradle to grave, so as to speak, rather than just the project life cycle. And the incorporation of ICMS, particularly with the recent publication of ICMS, the second edition, will bring us into that life cycle manner. And I think digitization and what Stephen will be talking to you about in relation to public BIM in a few minutes will be key on that basis. So I'm going to pass to Stephen, and if there's any questions, we can pick up on that at the end. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. Very informative presentation there. I'd like to welcome everybody to my presentation on building information modelling and the Capital Works Management Framework. My name is Stephen Lynham. I'm an engineer. I work as a technical advisor for construction contracts in the Office of Government Procurement. My presentation briefly, we've had our introduction, so we'll get straight into building information modelling, why BIM works and the applicable standards, BIM and the Capital Works Management Framework, and the government's BIM implementation strategy. This has all been born out of the Digital Roadmap 2021 for the Irish construction sector. What is building information modelling? Traditionally, we want to build an asset with X amount of accommodation on site X for X amount of money to be delivered by X date in the future with this set of inherent key values, broadly based on specifications and drawings. The BIM approach is we want to build an asset which has been fully coordinated during design phase in order to iron out construction risks and costs with X amount of accommodation on site X for X amount of money to be delivered by X date with this set of inherent key values that can plug in seamlessly into our current asset management database to be electronically managed without any separate information tailoring procedures once the project is handed over. I suppose this graphic here is one I've developed on a mind map, and it basically covers the entire CWMF processes. As you can see, there are several segments, very disfragmented. The stages don't necessarily align with stages for RIAI or Engineers Ireland or ACEI. But what BIM can do is BIM can bring all of these different project milestones and align them in a process that should work seamlessly for everybody involved, provided that everybody engages with the BIM process. What is building information modelling? We can see that we have the model in the centre here, and all around the model are the information inputs and outputs. The model probably only relates to about 25% of the actual BIM process. The rest all deals with the management of information and information transfer from concept through design, through to the construction process, and through to handover and maintenance. Building information modelling, I suppose most people would understand the model element of it, typically called a federated model. Federated model will include models from the architectural, from the structural, and from the services engineers. These three models combined together in one model is what's known as the federated model. From the federated model, we've taken a section here for so it's much more visual representation of what you're actually doing, and it shows how good coordination can develop a building to represent a mirror image of what needs to be built. It's based on systems and components. So we have ducting systems, we have fitted furniture components, we have sockets, foundations from engineers, domestic hot and cold water supplies, insulated render specifications for different finish types on walls. From the model then, this is where the information begins to transfer from the model through keynotes, from keynotes to specifications, and then ultimately from specifications into bills of quantities. On this example here, we've taken a typical glass screen. The glass screen has a keynote that's referenced within the model. The keynote is then linked to a specification, so it's quite easy for anybody to pick up on exactly where something is positioned within the spec based on the physical model. What do we get? We can get traditional outputs, so we'll have all our 2D drawings all developed from the models, but they are much better coordinated. So everything that is in the model has a place and a position on the drawing, so any conflicts are much easier to identify and are far easier to develop and work out prior to going to tender. The building information model can also be used as an analysis tool. This is just an example of a site analysis, developing a project on a very constricted site. Obviously developing CGIs for planning purposes, or maybe to sell it to a client, that they can actually see the building constructed prior to engaging fully in the project. A traditional approach, drawings, normally done in CAD or by hand. Plans, elevations, sections, details are all completely independent of one another, and they rely on somebody to have an intimate knowledge of the project. Specificationally is manually referenced. We see a lot of copy and pasting in the market, which invariably will lead to either over specification or incorrect specifications. Schedules are created in a spreadsheet, again a manual option. CGIs are created using a model based on drawings. The BIM approach is the building is modeled in 3D by all the designers using components and systems. This is done collaboratively, and the collaboration is defined within the building standards. 2D plans, elevations, sections, and details are all generated from the federated models. So if the information is not in the model, it doesn't appear on the plans or sections. This gives better definition of what was actually required from a design perspective. Data is either integrated into the model elements or referenced through links. So depending on the size of the project, you have the option to integrate the data within the BIM design tools, or you can have a separate link that once you click on an item within the model, it will activate a link and open up the information for you in relation to that particular entity. The computer generated imagery, it's done directly from the BIM model. So what's in the model is actually seen. There's no way to hide or to code the model to say that something is there when it's not. Standards, we've had a massive development in the standards area over the last couple of years. Pre-2019, it would have been BS 1192 is the standard for producing information. International standards have been developed. The new ISO 19650 series is well under development now. Parts 1, Parts 2, Parts 3, and Parts 5 are published. They're all available at shopstandards.ie. I would suggest that people get very familiar with these documents, as they will be the standards applicable to BIM development moving forward. What are the BIM risks? Standards are great, but SMEs don't have time to apply the standards correctly. This comes down to a lack of experience in the industry, and as we currently stand, we wouldn't feel that some of the smaller companies are in a position to fully implement BIM. So, and when we were trying to develop our BIM implementation plan, we've had to factor this in. And again, there are mixed interpretations of standards across professions and organizations. And this has a negative effect on the success of BIM adoption. Now, the NSAI at the moment are working on developing BIM standards across the entire industry in Ireland, which will include private and public sector works to adopt the same approach. This way, people working in either sector can move fluently in and out of private and commercial work and public sector work. Clients don't have a sufficient knowledge to procure BIM. This is probably one of the biggest obstacles. People assume BIM is going to cost a fortune. It will if it's not implemented properly, because you won't get the benefits of it. So clients have got to educate themselves in this space. It's important for industry professionals to determine how we adopt the standards and the technology. Otherwise, somebody else will make the decision for you, and you will be following the industry rather than leading it. By digitizing CWMF procedures, utilizing the BIM process, standards will be applied to the information structure from concept to asset management. This will develop better outcomes for asset delivery with a greater emphasis on quality, risk management, program, and cost certainty. Standardize the procurement process through digitalization. This really means is having the right information at the right time and at the right stage in the procurement process. BIM and the CWMF, this is kind of an overview of information and how clients are going to have to educate themselves. Initially, they're going to need an organizational information requirements, and that basically is the buy-in from the client to say that they are going to implement BIM and they're going to effectively resource it. From that, they need to develop asset information requirements. The asset information requirements relate directly to the type of properties that they manage or are responsible for. Following on from that, we have a pre-contract appointment and post-contract BIM execution plan. These are developed in tandem with consultants that the client will engage with. Again, this outlines, I suppose, the organizational requirements. Any organization needs to have an objective. They need to have a decision to procure an asset. They need to make an invitation to tender or request a proposal. Then they need to engage with the supply chain. Then they need to execute that, and then they need to operate it. And from the organized information requirements that clients need to develop in relation to their specific assets, they need to have training on BIM in order to understand how it works. Without that, you're going to be led by industry, which may not give the organization the actual information that they need. And again, on the left-hand side here is kind of a list of items that need to be addressed as BIM development progresses. Public sector BIM adoption strategy. The government has decided to mandate BIM on a phased basis. This is two reasons for this. This is to ensure that public bodies invest the necessary resources into BIM in line with the strategy, and to impose standards for delivery across public sector projects. The new European standards are in development and publication. As I've said already, the ISO 19650 series 1, 2, 3, and 5 are in, and series in development are 4 and 6. It's unlikely 4 is going to develop any further because there's an overlap with other standards. Certification of BIM capability through NSAI. Now, NSAI have set up a certification process for people who want to get involved with BIM and take BIM seriously, which will mean that for pre-qualification, you will actually have a certification to say that you're BIM compliant to ISO 19650 series standards. This is well worth investigating and talking to the NSAI directly in relation to training and requirements that are necessary for that certification. And development of a digital construction portal for the use with public works contracts. We're hoping to develop a portal that will have a login system, so each individual contributor to a project will have access rights, and all of the project information may be stored in this portal in relation to design development, procurement, statutory obligations, and all of the decision points that are needed in order to develop a project. And it'll be a enter once only principle. So once you have information in there, the system should be smart enough to be able to develop documentation for you to assist in your procurement based on information and decision points that have already been made. This here is about the collaboration. We need to get digitally literate. We need to engage with the design element of a project in order to train them up to the point to where we're comfortable that they're able to roll out BIM on a project. The plan will be initially the BIM implementation process will apply to the design disciplines only. We don't feel that the smaller contractors are quite there yet in relation to developing BIM models. The whole idea of this is that we can help trained professionals in the industry in relation to how to develop models properly for public works procurements, and then that they will be able to use that information and assist the actual contractors in developing their BIM procedures. So we'll open up another avenue of business for our SMEs. And the implementation strategy, this has all been driven by the EU BIM Task Group. They've produced a handbook. It's aimed at public policy users, national or local public client procure users, or operator users responsible for the ongoing management and operation of built assets. This document is well worth a read for anybody that has the time to do so. It does sort of lay out the European directive in relation to the use of BIM for public works sector in the European Union. And again, I've looked at the stages of the current CWMF, and while currently we have a stage 1 to 5, there's possibly going to be 2 new stages, to be stage 0 and a stage 6. Whether they'll actually be called these or not now is another thing. But we are certainly looking at a second coming of the CWMF procedures. So we need to realign these so they fluently work in with the RIAI stages, the Engineers Ireland stages, the ACI stages, so that individual aspects of work can be clearly defined and definitively housed within a particular stage of a project. What are the risks to the Irish construction sector? Appropriately define the BIM requirements. If this is not done, we won't have an asset register. Without an asset register, it's very difficult to define what your BIM requirements will need to be. We need to manage risk in accordance with the CWMF procurement rules, something that's not done very well at the moment. You need to define a digital plan of works, which means producing the right information at the right time throughout the entire project. We need to define classification systems for all disciplines that promotes collaboration. So the integration between quantity surveyors, architects, engineers, M&E disciplines, all needs to work seamlessly. So the classification system is important for people to engage in and to make sure that any aspect that they develop in relation to the BIM models has that classification system attached to the data that's being input. We need to systemize the efficiencies. This will be done through the collaboration process in BIM. We will develop new professional skills. We'll find out quicker ways to do things, simpler ways to do things, a more effective way to do things. The only way that this can be done is through training and being resourced by clients. It would also mean that design disciplines will have to avail of training and invest in resources themselves to upskill themselves to be able to deliver projects using BIM. Same will apply to construction contractors. The IT infrastructure for clients to engage in a collaborative process. This needs to be cloud-based, so everybody has access to it at all times. We need to centralize open resources, so the information that's put in there needs to be in an open source format. So we need to engage with professionals, clients, government agencies to develop user-friendly BIM toolkits. And this will help benchmark BIM in the Irish construction sector, and it will provide opportunities for all stakeholders involved. That's the end of my presentation. I'd like to thank Charles and Michelle for allowing us the time to make this, and we'll take any questions you have thereafter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles and Stephen. That was an excellent presentation. A lot of topics covered there, and some real valuable information shared. So thank you very much. Just before we start focusing into asking some questions of our panelists, I'd just like to actively encourage everybody to engage with the Q&A function. As I said at the start of the conference, this is your conference, so the more you give into it, the more you'll get out of it. Now, we have received some questions prior to this morning, so I'll just kick some of those off. Charles, I might just direct this one to you, if I may. Is there an intention to map the National Standard of Building Elements against ICMS in a manner similar to that carried out for the NRM by RICS?
Well, yes, there is. There's a working group there, which I'm a member of. I think Jerry, we heard from earlier on, is a member there as well, and a few other people in the audience. We're breaking that up in the next week or so, actually, into a function around the National Standard of Building Elements, and breaking it down both into the narratives and the actual matrix that I showed earlier on my slides. The intention is at a high level, similar to NRM, because now I stand open to correction on this. NRM, when it was mapped, to use NRM 1 and mapped it against the main building attributes, and that would be our first starting point. So the work on that will be starting in the next couple of weeks, early November, I imagine, and we'll be in a position then whereby hopefully before the new year that will be there as part of the training modules in conjunction with Engineers Ireland and the SCSI.
Thanks very much, Charlie. That's great. Just perhaps a follow-on question then. Does the ICMS provide attributes at level 1 for all construction sectors in the Irish market?
Well, the benefit of the ICMS is that it does cover many of the construction sectors we have. I did make reference earlier on to marine, and our own Department of Marine, Agriculture, Fisheries and Marine has provided the first stage of submission for attributes for say marine civil engineering works. So that's something that we have a department that works in those manners. So the quick answer, I suppose, is no, it doesn't have everything we need, but the benefit of SCSI being involved and the standard setting committee and ICMS as a whole is that it can actually be amended at any stage and incorporates best practice on a global basis. So we get a chance to enter in our wish list there, so to speak, and we get to engage with other members globally. In short, we'll get there, Colin.
Yeah, thanks very much, Charlie. That's great. I might just throw this one out to the floor. I don't know whether Stephen or yourself are best placed to answer this one, Charlie, but will the inclusion of ICMS in the Capital Works Management Framework be a major change or catalyst for change going forward?
I think, and I think Stephen will come in on this with me in a minute. From my perspective, it's going to change how we present our costs, but it's not going to change how we carry out our function. It's a reporting format more than anything else. So it's about moving on from previous traditions and evolving those into a new tradition, which will be our cost management structures. It's going to work for both public and private, but in the Capital Works Management Framework, I think it'll work well with us with the digitalization. I think it will increase, as I said, towards the asset management function that the state has. And I think coming on to what Stephen has, there's a lot of functionalities that life cycle costing and other aspects where I believe that the introduction of BIM and the incorporation of ICMS into that BIM affair will be of benefit. And I suppose, Stephen, I'll hand that bit over to you and ask for your comment on that.
Yeah, I definitely think it'll have a big impact, because what it'll bring is it'll bring a consistency to the approach of cost analysis right across the board, from engineering, the architectural side, the M&E side. The standardization of the information that they have to produce will give the QS a far better handle on exactly what's needed. And I think the more it's implemented, the more used to it we're going to get. And I just think it'll become business as usual within the space of 12 to 14 months. You know, people are just going to get customized to having to provide this information. It's the EU directives are sending us there in relation to life cycle analysis, you know, all this sort of stuff. So we've got to pick up the ball on this one. It will be embedded into the system. So as you develop your costs and analysis of the project, the BIM will actually manipulate the information for you, and it will have it there at the end of the project. That's it.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Stephen. Just on behalf of everybody this morning, I'd just like to thank you both very much for your presentations. Excellent piece of work, and thank you very much indeed. Next up, we have a presentation from Dr. Dermot Keeley. Dermot is a chartered quantity surveyor who has vast knowledge of construction industry in both the United States and Ireland today. Today is going to speak to us about life cycle costing and Irish approach. In 2007, Dermot joined the School of Surveying and Construction Management in TU Dublin, and is currently delivering programs and modules on the quantity surveying session platform. Dermot has experience and has carried out extensive research in the areas of digitization in construction, sustainability, and life cycle costing. He has completed his PhD in leveraging building information modeling for life cycle costing in 2016, and collaborates with numerous BIM technology vendors, educating students and practitioners in digitization and BIM, as well as providing consultancy services in the same field. I'd now invite Dermot to give his presentation.
Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Dermot Keeley. I'm here to discuss life cycle costing, or more for feasibility and appraisal, both on a macro level, so looking at the building or looking at the business venture where we might rent rather than construct, or construct versus rent, whether we might refurbish an existing building versus building a new building on a greenfield site, whether we go with a more traditional building versus something that's more sustainable or green, and evaluating that over a longer period of time, not just the construction cost. So life cycle costing will give us that tool to evaluate on a macro level, but it will also give us a tool to evaluate on a micro level. So looking at component selection, looking at whether we might go with PVC windows, whether we might go with timber frame windows, whether we might go with certain renewable technologies, and looking at the payback of those components or specification. Also gives us opportunity to look at energy modeling, look at the evaluation of credits in terms of LEED and BREEAM buildings. What are those credits? You know, what do those credits cost from a capital point of view, from a capital cost point of view, but also from a life cycle costing point of view. And as I said before, looking at our renewable technologies, looking at solar panels, whether we can incorporate them on the roof of a building, what are the payback, what are the capital costs, and is there a return on investment for our client. And again, as I said, in terms of asset management, so if we evaluate life cycle costing throughout the design period, and we come up with a reasonable scope or reasonable cost from an annual maintenance point of view, plan preventive maintenance point of view, we can hand that cost over to the facilities manager, and they can control those costs or work to that specific budget. Anything over and above and beyond that particular budget is going to have an impact on the facilities manager, and they can control those costs or work to that specific budget. Anything over and above and beyond that particular budget is going to have an impact on the profitability of the project. So if you expend more than what was originally budgeted in terms of maintenance costs, you may be eating into the profit of that particular business venture. So what are examples of successful use of life cycle costing in Irish public procurement? Well, as I said before, the use of procurement systems such as public-private partnerships, whereby you're evaluating the tender not just on construction costs, but you're evaluating that tender based on its operational costs. From a public-private partnership point of view, the government isn't just paying for the actual build itself, they're also paying for maybe a yearly lease or a yearly rent or a yearly service or conveyance charge on that particular building over the course of, say, 20 or 25 years. So they'll need to know, as in the government will need to know how much that building costs over that period of time. So when you're evaluating a tender, you need to evaluate it both from a capital point of view, capital cost point of view, and from an OPEX point of view. When you're looking at design build and design build procurement and design build tenders, it's worthwhile looking at that from the most economically advantageous tender, because you're not just getting a tender based on construction costs, you're also getting a tender based on a design or an interpretation of a design. So of course the design team takes it so far, and then when it's been tendered and it's been bid by your design team contractor, they're evaluating and proposing certain materials, certain, I suppose, interpretation of that design team's design. And in doing so, if you evaluate a most economically advantageous tender, you should be evaluating the life cycle cost, or how the costs, the future costs or operational costs are impacted by that design, because each contractor has a different interpretation or a different design. Okay, so public procurement in Ireland is, from a cost point of view, is governed by our Capital Works Management Framework. In terms of cost and cost management and quantity surveying, our guidance notes 2.2 outline how we should control our costs on capital projects or government projects. And as part of our guidance notes 2.2, whole life cycle costs are an important consideration throughout the design process and should be integrated at each stage in the cost plan or the cost planning process. So I suppose when we do a capital cost plan, as quantity surveyors working on public projects, we should be doing a life cycle cost plan. The problem is, in Ireland, unlike many of our European neighbours, our traditional procurement prevails. So the majority of our public works is carried out through lowest cost, traditional design, bid and build. The contractor doesn't have a say in the actual design of the project, whereby it's fully designed or should be fully designed, a bill of quantity is produced, and each of the contractors bidding on that particular project is pricing that bill. So from a life cycle costing point of view, they really don't have any hand in the operational cost of that building. That's already set in stone through the full design of that building. So there's no need for a life cycle costing exercise to be carried out on a traditional procurement other than in the design process, other than the evaluation of that design from an option appraisal point of view earlier in the design process. From a contractor's point of view, they don't really have any influence on the design or the operational cost, other than maybe the selection of materials or specification, which is based on some sort of international standard spec. So are we using life cycle costing in traditional procurement? No, not in the formulated sense. As cost consultants in Ireland, we might provide some advice in respect to the impact of the selection of certain materials throughout the design stage, but it's kind of more anecdotal more than anything else. If you select that material, it'll cost you a little bit more. If you select this more durable material, you may save money over the service life of that building. Occasionally, when the client requests a life cycle cost exercise, we've done them in the past, but a lot of time we're flying in that expertise in from the UK or in from Europe to do the exercise, do the life cycle exercise, and they're gone again a week later, a couple of weeks later after they've carried it out. So what are the barriers to the implementation of life cycle costing in Ireland? Well, first of all, as I said before, Contractors, from a life cycle costing point of view, really don't have a role in a determination of how that building performs, because logically, once it's fully designed and it's constructed, irrespective of what contractor constructs it, it should be the same in terms of its performance life and its life cycle costing, so long as they construct it to the actual specification and they construct it to good quality. So contractors really don't have a role in the design, and they don't have a role in life cycle costing. There's so many variables in life cycle costing that it's confusing to the quantity surveyors. You've got your escalation rates, you've got your discount rates, and you've got your study periods. And if you don't have a background in finance, if you don't have a background in accountancy, possibly you don't really understand that and what they mean and how to calculate those life cycle costs. Again, sometimes there's confusion with terminology. What's life cycle assessment? What's life cycle costing? Bit of a typo there. What's whole life cycle costing? As I said before, the calculations can be complex. They can be long-winded, and it can take, if you're doing a detailed life cycle costing exercise, it can take a considerable amount of time, and you could possibly burn up all your fee doing so. Again, another issue is access to the life cycle cost databases. Where do I get the costs on cleaning? Where do I get the costs on energy? Where do I get the costs on maintenance? We don't have a history in doing life cycle costs, so we don't have a history in collecting that information. So where do we start? We've been told that there's no use for rules of measurement or guidance notes, although that's changed in the recent past. We got ISO standards, we got the BCAS supplement in the UK, we got standards from the US, we got information papers from the RICS and information papers from our own Society of Chartered Surveyors Ireland. Another issue is that clients aren't requesting life cycle costing. They're not requesting it, even though it's in the Capital Works Management Framework, which I'll discuss in a few moments, mainly because they don't understand it. They don't really know what they're looking at. Again, as a quantity surveyor, what software do I use for life cycle costing, and who's going to provide the training? So we have some issues that many of them we're working through. There's more awareness of life cycle costing in the last couple of years than there might have been in the past, and in college in TU Dublin we are looking at it and training our graduates to be a little more proficient in life cycle costing, so hopefully when they come out they can do some of these exercises. What are our opportunities for life cycle costing in Ireland in public procurement? Well, in our Capital Works Management Framework, as I said before, we really should be doing life cycle costing. The level of detail is quite ambiguous in what's required. We should be doing some sort of life cycle. What are our opportunities for life cycle costing in Ireland in public procurement? Well, in our Capital Works Management Framework, as I said before, we really should be doing life cycle costing. The level of detail is quite ambiguous in what's required. We should be doing some sort of life cycle cost exercise with our capital cost at that different incremental stage of the design process. This is also ingrained in the International Construction Management Standards, which will be adopted by our Capital Works Management Framework in due course. So we can carry out incremental analysis or life cycle analysis throughout the design. It doesn't have to be overbearing, it doesn't have to be too long-winded, but at least it gives our client an indication of maybe what option appraisal, what type of building, what orientation of the building, what different types of design or options have a bearing on the life cycle cost. When you get down to component selection, as I said before, you can do some value engineering. You can look at the different design and components of that building. You can look at different renewable technologies and what their paybacks are, how durable one particular material is versus another alternative of that material, and look at providing a building and design that is as durable as it can be, that is as maintenance free as it can be, and that has a lower life cycle costing than maybe another alternative. We can look at parallel tendering. We can look at named specialists in terms of providing, this could be even in the traditional procurement process, where we've got a design, bid, build project, but we've got our mechanical electrical works which are being tendered through a design build process. And if we're doing that, yes, the contractor doesn't have a whole lot of impact on the structural and architectural works in terms of life cycle costing, but from an M&E point of view, which is heavily weighed in terms of operational costs, in terms of maintenance and its durability and planned preventative maintenance, the contractor can present their design, can tender on the basis of providing a design that might have better life cycle costing than their tendering counterpart. We can get earlier contractor involvement in the traditional procurement process. We can bring in two-stage tendering, whereby we get a contractor involved earlier in the project than we do in the traditional procurement process. And we either pay them a fee to provide consultancy advice in terms of life cycle costing, or we can novate them after that period of time and actually get them to construct a project, having given that advice. So there is opportunities for life cycle costing in the public procurement and even in the traditional procurement process. In terms of life cycle costing and procurement, we've got the European Directive 2014-24, and this EU directive, when transposed into Irish legislation, and I believe it has already been transposed into Irish legislation, will not only restrict life cycle costing to the most economically advantageous tender. We will have an option to include life cycle costing in the lowest cost evaluation. I suppose that would be an example I've said before in relation to design build contractors. When you're evaluating lowest cost, you should evaluate the design in terms of lowest cost from an operational point of view. But I suppose from a design bid build point of view, and if they don't have a bearing on the life cycle of that building because they're not designing it, there's really no need to include life cycle costing in that regard. But it expands life cycle costing from public procurement point of view to include it in both low cost and most economically advantageous tender. In terms of the International Construction Measurement Standard, it's worthwhile just to have a quick look at this. I know one of my colleagues has already discussed it, or will be discussing it, but looking at its capabilities in terms of life cycle costing. So it just doesn't, the International Construction Measurement Standards, in terms of its incorporation in Ireland, in the near future, won't just look at capital costs, won't just look at construction costs. It expands what is currently our national standard building elements and our cost planning process in Ireland to include life cycle costing. And in terms of a breakdown structure, it takes the existing ISO standard, the 196865, uses that kind of, I suppose, work breakdown structure, which a lot of quantities of areas are already familiar with. So that's an advantage, and it provides some templates, it provides a breakdown structure, and also gives us an opportunity to provide life cycle costing at the different stages of design, not in the same detail, in terms of the same level of codes that you might see in terms of construction costs, but it provides us an opportunity to do life cycle costing maybe on a higher or lesser level of codes. So in terms of the time it takes to do life cycle costing, which is quite detailed, possibly in the equivalent of maybe level 3 or level 4s in the ICMS, we maybe have the opportunity to do life cycle costing on the level 2 codes, which wouldn't take us as long. So it provides a meaningful, I suppose, framework for doing life cycle costing that hasn't been there before. In terms of life cycle cost calculations, this is an extract, or this figure is an extract from the ICMS. When we're calculating construction costs, we're all aware that we inflate to a future date, and that future date may be a fixed type contract, which may be the tender date or the award date, or it may be to a fluctuating price contract, which could be the handover date or the agreement to the final account. Whether it's the start of the end of construction and the handover date, or whether it's what is called the base date, which is year 0, which is the tender date or contract award date, it doesn't really matter. Those future costs need to be discounted back. So again, when you're dealing with life cycle costing calculations, you escalate to a future date, and then you discount those costs back to what would be called year 0 or would be a common date. And this gives you an opportunity to evaluate different scenarios, different construction options, different project options in a net present value, in a lump sum that brings everything back and accounts for the time value of money. Sounds a bit more complicated than it actually is, and it's all based on having the awareness of life cycle costing, understanding, and having that little bit of education and training in it. But it's not as onerous as it actually looks. The International Construction Measurement Standards provides an interesting template for life cycle costing, whereby those costs are provided in forecast costs, which are essentially escalated costs. Another word for that is the nominal costs. So those are the future costs of the building, and those costs are then discounted back to net present values. So you can see it's not just like construction costs where we've got a quantity, a rate, and a cost. Now we've got a quantity, a rate, a cost, a future cost, a discounted cost, and also you've got the real costs of today's money. And to evaluate life cycle costing, you have to know what it costs today. So there's three, that's where you can see the complexity in this issue. You have three different types or three different ways of presenting those costs. Again, it's not quite as complicated as it looks. The ICMS provides a nice, neat framework for doing that and provides us a template for providing those costs to our clients. So hopefully in the next number of years, that will be ingrained in our capital works management framework and providing some sort of advice on life cycle costing in Ireland for our clients. The biggest issue in life cycle costing, of course, is access to meaningful data. So where do we start? Again, as I said before, where do we get our cleaning costs? Where do we get our maintenance costs? Where do we get our energy costs? We're quite proficient in the calculation of construction costs, and in doing so, we're actually quite proficient in the calculation of renewal costs, or the replacement of those construction costs, because we're just essentially escalating those costs to a future date, be it 5 years or 10 years time, when that item gets replaced. But in terms of the operational costs, so to speak, the cost of maintaining and operating that building, they're a little bit different. So data, unfortunately, in life cycle costing, because there's so many different ways of collecting that data, it can be categorized and presented in a myriad of ways. The ICMS, hopefully, will lead to consistency, whereby robust data can be used and preferably shared to introduce more certainty into the prediction and control of life cycle costs. So if we have a good work breakdown structure, a good categorical structure, as well as in terms of presenting a life cycle cost exercise, it's going to have its advantages, but it's also going to have advantages throughout the operational period of that building. So in terms of collecting data and feeding it back into a future life cycle cost exercise of a similar building, the ICMS will provide that breakdown structure. So, in summary, life cycle costing is not currently carried out, unfortunately, in Ireland, in our traditional procurement, which is our prevailing procurement system. Life cycle costing is carried out with procurement systems that evaluate the building over a longer period of time. Life cycle costing is incorporated into a capital works management framework in terms of providing cost advice throughout the design, although it's not necessarily carried out that frequently. The ICMS version 2 is incorporating life cycle costs, which is good because that eventually will be incorporated into our capital works management framework, and we'll have a new, I suppose, national standard building elements which will incorporate service life spans and life cycle costing. It's important that our quantity surveyors have the knowledge and training to carry out life cycle costing, and that's starting with obviously our students in college, training up our existing practitioners and giving them an opportunity to do those calculations and provide that service for our clients. And then, as I said before on the last slide, the collection of life cycle cost information is important as well. There is third-party databases that we can, use to start with, maybe the BCAS in the UK, RS Means in the US, but this will be up to individual jurisdictions, countries, quantity surveyors working in certain companies, facilities managers to come together and to calculate that data to provide a database that maybe everyone else can use. So it could be a role for the Society of Chartered Surveyors in Ireland to provide that mechanism whereby we can add information into a database that everyone can use. So I hope you got something from that presentation, and I'm looking forward to hearing some questions, or I'm looking forward to getting some questions from you guys. Thanks very much.
2, 1.
Thank you very much, Dermot. That was an excellent presentation, very informative, and a lot of ground covered there. So much ground covered, in fact, that we've run against the clock. So rather than taking questions in this particular forum, we'll move to our networking event, and Dermot will join that particular session. And if anybody wishes to pose particular questions to Dermot there, please just link in with him. A slide will pop up on the screen in a few moments, just showing delegates how to access the networking session. The session will conclude at 11:10. So when you finish, please click back on the main stage to join the presentation again. So go and enjoy a well-deserved coffee, and we'll speak to you at 11:10. Thank you.
1.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your coffee. Just a small piece of housekeeping, if I may. I'd just like to apologize for the intermittent drop off in the previous presentation. Obviously, you can appreciate with the difficult environment we're working in at the moment that these technical glitches do occur, so apologies for that. Equally, I'd just like to remind people that, in fact, on the hop-in platform, the questions should be lodged through the chat function rather than the Q&A function. So we'll move swiftly on. We're very lucky today to be joined by Dr. Tim de Jong, who is based in the Netherlands. Dr. de Jong will be discussing ICMS 3 and carbon counting, giving an example of both new construction and refurbishment projects in which the total cost of ownership and carbon have been estimated. Dr. Tim de Jong is a housing economist advisor with over 40 years of experience in new construction, renovation and maintenance projects. His main clients are housing associations and school boards. In his advice on life cycle costs, he includes the environmental impact of the construction and use of buildings. I'll now hand you over to Dr. Tim to present his presentation.
Okay. Dear colleagues, construction economists, I'm hoping that you hear me because it's not clear to me. It's an honor for me to talk to you about the quantifying CO2 in construction from especially the perspective of informing decision-making about sustainable construction projects in advance. I will do this on the basis of some examples from my own professional practice, and I will start with an example of low-carbon homes in Zealand. This project is located in the small town of Groede. It concerns a new construction project for the elderly, and the housing association wants to realize it in such a way that CO2 emissions are minimized. Since we are here together in an international company of cost consultants, it makes sense to use the International Construction Measurement Standard for communication about cost and qualities. Since we will discuss carbon emissions of construction, or rather of buildings, we may use the definitions of environmental pollution as given in the European Standard 15804. Let's take a closer look at the ICMS 2 life cycle cost breakdown. ICMS 2 discerns 6 categories of life cycle costs related to the most important categories of activities and products in the life cycle of a building. Here you see them: acquisition, construction, renewal, operation, maintenance, end of life. All of these categories have their own cost breakdown in ICMS. So far for ICMS 2, and now about carbon counting. What is carbon counting? To make sure that we are in line with the relevant scientific insights on environmental pollution and climate change, we have linked our approach to the European Standard 15804. This standard distinguishes 5 pollution categories and 2 depletion categories. We'll zoom in on the pollution and depletion categories. Here you see them. The abbreviations stand for global warming potential, ozone depletion potential, acidification potential, eutrophication potential, photochemical ozone creation potential, and the lower 2 are depletion categories: abiotic resource depletion of mineral elements and abiotic depletion of fossil fuels. We can't go in these categories in more detail because of the time, but most important one for the climate change problems is the global warming potential. Here, obviously, the global warming emissions of a product or an activity are categorized. There are more emissions than CO2 alone, but emissions in this category share their potential for global warming. Their effect is quantified in units called kilogram CO2 equivalents. When we talk about carbon counting or CO2 counting, we actually talk about counting global warming potential emissions. In the European standard 15804, the pollution and depletion in the 7 mentioned categories are also divided into life cycle stages, as we can see here. You see the product stage, the construction, the use stage, and the end of life stage of the product. And finally, an external for effects that are beyond the scope of the product itself. All these stages are subdivided in substages, as you see, and not surprisingly, the stages in the EN 15804 are very similar to the life cycle stages categories in ICMS 2. There is a bit of a catch there, as the European Standard 15804 sees on separate construction products, while ICMS considers the cost of a building composed of several products and processes. That's a slight difference, but I will leave that for another time and go on to the project in Zealand. As mentioned, the Housing Association wants a low carbon project and of course uses a life cycle approach in order to achieve that goal, rightly so. In this life cycle approach, there is good insulation, heat pumps and solar panels, and therefore the project scores already quite well at low carbon. My consultancy had a look at the materials for the building as proposed by the architect, and we were able to advise some amendments that would reduce CO2 emissions in the overall life cycle by another 15%. As you see in the graph, at the same level of construction costs. In this graph, you see the overall life cycle cost of the design in its original specification and in the specification with materials as proposed by my consultancy, and that are the blue bars. These are the costs, and the green bars represent the according carbon at the same overall level. To the left, the original, those two, and to the right, the alternative. In this graph, we have insight into where in the life cycle the CO2 impact occurs. As you see, I have divided both cost and carbon over the life cycle categories of ICMS 2. In these newly constructed houses, the cost and CO2 of the operation stage that you see here are relatively low compared to the construction costs that you see here. It is hard to lower them any further at the present stage of the technique, these costs here. But carbon levels in the construction stage are still rather high, as you see, and there must be an opportunity for reduction there. As you can see, we managed to realize a reduction by proposing a few changes, and we will see what they are in a minute. So here you see the difference in carbon. In this graph, you see the breakdown of the construction cost and the incorporated carbon according to ICMS 2. We can zoom in to look where the differences are made. Apparently, the biggest leap in carbon is made in the structure. This is done by applying timber frame walls and timber floors instead of concrete. In this particular project, this change happens to be cost neutral, as you see at the blue bars. In the architectural works or the non-structural works, you may see some minor changes in costs and carbon levels. These are due to applying timber windows instead of plastic and the application of a timber frame ceiling instead of a simple spraying of the underside of the concrete floor. If you have a wooden floor, you need this type of ceiling. In the services, the big difference is getting rid of the overkill of solar panel that was in the original plan. And they produce much more electricity than you could use, and it's questionable whether the electricity company can make effective use of the surplus. At the external works, there's also a minor change. We thought it would be fun in a housing estate near the sea in Zealand to make seashell footpath instead of concrete tiles. The CO2 impact of seashells is actually lower than that of concrete tiles, but in the bigger picture, you can hardly see the difference. So it's more a signal than a real effect. We go back to a higher level for the moment. As you may see, the maintenance cost is slightly higher for the alternative specification. That is due to the wooden window frames. Unlike plastic, they need regular paintwork. In the overall picture, it's not a big deal. But it's clear that an intervention in one stage of the life cycle may have effects on another stage. Referring to the previous presentation, you may think, well, your maintenance cost and operational costs are quite low, and that's in contrary of what the previous speaker said. But this is housing, and in housing it's a little bit different from other types of buildings. Especially energy costs and the related carbon impact as part of the operation stage is dependent on several decisions in the construction stage. In order to reduce energy in the operation stage, several design decisions may do. Let's go to the construction cost specification of ICMS 2. Along with heating and ventilation services, here, in particular, the envelope of the building has an impact on the energy use in the operation stage. As you see, the envelope of the building is not a distinguished category at this level of the ICMS model. It is part of the architectural works or non-structural works. In my opinion, it would be very helpful for making carbon decisions to have that changed. For instance, like this. By separating envelope and interior as parts of the architectural work, we could make dedicated decisions on both parts of the building. I will leave that discussion for this moment and have just the following remark. Carbon counting is not a goal in itself, but a means to reduce carbon emissions in the whole life cycle of buildings. It is not just about energy, it's not just about choosing the right materials, but it is also about balancing construction and operation emissions. To make this better understood, we may focus on circular economy for a while. In that connection, I was inspired by a book by Stuart Brand, How Buildings Learn and What Happens After They Are Built. Brand shows that a building consists of several layers, and each of them has its own life cycle. Whatever you may read that for yourselves, it reads like holiday stuff, lots of pictures and so on. But maybe it's hard to get because it was first published in 1994. The main lesson from this book, however, is not to look at a building as a heap of materials, but as a layer of different functions with specific life cycles, connected more to the pace of the change in society than to the pace of deterioration of the involved materials. Anyway, if we think of buildings in a circular economy, we can start to consider the building as a unit more than as a bunch of materials. So if we look at the stages of the life cycle of a building as discerned by ICMS 2, we may acknowledge these stages could be part of a cycle. For instance, like this. So you see that the end of life in a circular economy should be the end of a life cycle. And it's not really an end. So this should lead to another new beginning. If we regard this cycle as a time cycle, maybe it should be more like this. Renewal, that is minor functional adaptations within a building, here. Operation and maintenance are the activities that occur along each other in the same use stage of the building. I put them here together. End of life cycle and acquisition are the same event from different perspectives. And construction is, in most of the occasions, referring to renovation or refurbishment rather than to new construction. If we look at the life cycle of buildings in this way, the overestimation of new construction as compared to refurbishment may come down a bit to the right proportions. To conclude this story, I would like to take you with me to an example of refurbishment. That is reducing carbon in a housing estate in Almere. Almere is a new town started in the 1970s in the IJsselmeerpolders, mainly as an extra housing opportunity for an overcrowded Amsterdam. This particular housing estate was an answer to the usual gallery access flats of those days. As you may see, the architectural form of the apartment buildings is inspired by the Amsterdam canal type of houses. In that respect, the estate can be considered to be part of our cultural heritage. The focus of the project is on insulating of the building envelope and adaptation of the building surfaces in order to expand the lifespan of the buildings and at the same time reduce the carbon impact of it in relation to the climate change goals. In this graph, I have compared cost and CO2 emissions of the refurbishment, here to the left, on a life cycle level to the new construction of similar housing accommodation, here on the right. The figure shows the very interesting effects. Both cost and carbon of the refurbishment are clearly lower than cost and carbon of new construction. This is on life cycle basis. In this particular case, carbon compared to cost is higher in case of renovation than in case of new construction. How come? Look at the specification along the lines of ICMS. The levels of cost and carbon in the use stage of the building are largely equal. However, the construction costs are much higher for new construction. The same applies to the level of carbon emissions from construction. Look at this graph that shows the specified costs and carbon emissions of the distinguished ICMS construction cost groups. And now you see why I would like to discern the envelope as a separate cost group, as I've done here. The main effort in terms of costs is on this category. And moreover, the carbon emissions here are sky high. Is that wise? Yes, probably it is, because as you see here, the increased cost and carbon in the construction stage of the refurbishment project is more than compensated in the use stage of the building. If we look again at the general level of the building's life cycle, we see this effect reflected. This means that if the project is carried out without energy savings, such as installing an external insulation system and adjusting heating and ventilation systems, the total cost of ownership is likely to be higher than for the measures included. But what about the sky-high carbon levels in the building envelope? Maybe that can be reduced anyway. We did not look at that just now, and maybe one of you people are have an idea for how to do that. Well, my presentation ends here. I hope I have entertained you as far. I have tried to show you that cost and carbon can be counted in the same way, and that this can give us a better understanding of where to act. Energy and materials must be given equal attention in our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. I also tried to show you that renovation can serve as a carbon reduction tool in a circular economic approach. Finally, I hope you agree that ICMS can be useful to communicate on this topic. Thank you for your attention. At the very bottom, you will see my own website listed. I assume you will somehow get this slideshow. I would have preferred to give you the EcoQuestor website, but it is only in Dutch. This way you can collect some information if you wish. At least you can reach me to ask questions. Thank you again. That was it.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a very insightful presentation, and I think we'd all agree that issues around carbon, particularly in our current environment, are big issues that we need to consider in the built environment. Tim, I might just pose some questions that came in previous to your presentation, if I may. So just picking up on some of the points that you've raised there. In Holland, you seem to have a database with carbon data of materials and construction products, one that's easily accessible for all calculations linked to costings. It doesn't appear to me that everybody in the world has that sort of function or facility. Is that something that we think we need to make more available to people?
I think so, yes. The database we use is a private database of a corporation of 10 cost consultancies, and in order to avoid extra work in this field, we have integrated the carbon data into our cost database, so we can make the calculations in one go. It is of course a good idea to share this information with other people, or maybe within the CEEC. But we should be aware that the data in the database, in our database, are rather crude still, and there are other bodies in Europe that are dealing with data of construction products, as for instance the Eco platform, and that's an international body which tries to coordinate environmental product declarations in the construction product industry. Maybe we, as cost consultants, could help them, also related to the ICMS, to direct the information of their products more to the specific needs of handling them in a construction project.
Thanks very much, Tim. Just leading on from that, that sounds like a lot of work.
We integrate this type of data into a cost database because it appears to be that carbon is attached to the same elements that we use in calculation, and it's as I've seen the other presentations this morning, I think the way of approaching elements as we do is very similar like you do it in Ireland. So there could be an opportunity there.
Tim, you showed us 2 examples of construction projects from your own practice. Are these typical representative samples of Dutch construction projects?
Yes, in a way they are. The type of houses or the type of projects is quite common in Dutch practice of housing, new construction and refurbishment. But the focus on lower carbon is still very rare, also in Holland. So in that sense, the examples are not representative.
Thanks, Tim. Just a couple of more questions, if I may. Is it common in the Netherlands to consider CO2 emissions as a problem to deal with in construction? Presume it probably is, much the same way as it is in Ireland.
Yes, in general, people tend to consider it really as a problem, but if it comes to act on a project basis, it's largely overshadowed by other types of problems. Though lately, that is the last couple of years, 5 years or so, the housing associations who have a large partition of the housing stock in the Netherlands, they are more and more interested in dealing with carbon in projects and especially for the existing stock. And they also are encouraged in that way by the government. Yeah, okay, I leave that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Tim. And I suppose just one final question for me, if I may, is that with carbon and retrofitting, it can be perceived as expensive, and maybe that's a deterrent for people to engage in that. But is there a system of grants, or how are the particular works funded and to cover the costs involved?
Yeah, there are grants for energy saving measures, but these grants are, well, are not dealing, I think, in my opinion, with in a correct way with the carbon problem, because as I hope that I have showed you that the carbon is not cannot be dealt with only by lowering energy use in the usage of the buildings, but we should also look at the materials that are used and the incorporated carbon, or that might be a wrong word, the carbon emissions that these materials take with them.
Thank you very much, Tim. That's been very insightful, as I say, and an excellent presentation. So on behalf of the delegates, I'd like to thank you for your time this morning. We'll be moving on to our next presentation shortly, but we just would, as I say, with everything technical, we just need a few moments to get set up. So if you could bear with us for a few moments before we get our next speakers on stage, that would be fantastic. Thank you. Welcome back, folks. We're nearly at the end of our session, and we're delighted to welcome Conor Hogan and John Curtin to talk a bit about the new alternative private sector contract. So in September, the SCSI and the CIF, along with Engineers Ireland, launched the alternative private sector contract. As I say, we're joined by Conor and John, who are both involved in the preparation of this contract, and will discuss its merits for the construction market. Just to give a title to their presentation, it's the balancing of risk with greater certainty of cost, a new contract approach for the Irish construction market. So just to introduce the two speakers, Conor Hogan is a Chartered Quantity Surveyor, Fellow of the Society of Chartered Surveyors in Ireland and the RICS. He's a qualified barrister, and Conor was a past president of the SCS before it merged to form the SCSI. He's a director of Joseph C. Hogan and Sons Chartered Quantity Surveyor, and he was an Irish representative on the CEEC for many years. John Curtin is a Chartered Quantity Surveyor and a Fellow of the Society of Chartered Surveyors in Ireland and RICS, and is also a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Building and an Institute of Arbitrators. John is a Director with PJ Hegarty and Sons, one of Ireland's leading building and civil engineering companies. John is also a past President of the SCSI and has served as Chairman of the Liaison Committee of the Construction Industry. He lectures for the Law Society in Diploma in Construction Law and is also holds a professional diploma in architectural practices from TU Dublin. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Conor to commence the presentation.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I think no, still in the morning time, just about. It's great to be able to be at a CEEC presentation again. It's many years since I was a delegate to the CEEC, and I have very many happy memories. And hopefully sometime when all this COVID-19 is over, we can meet again and in a face-to-face situation and enjoy each other's company, not only and learn from each other. What we're going to talk about today, both John and myself, we're both quantity surveyors, but we both come from slightly different backgrounds. I work on the private side, or the client side, I suppose you could say, and John works on the contractor side. We both come at it for the same reason, from the point of view of fairness, I suppose, in contract terms, I would hope, but fairness to both parties, both the client and the contractor. So what I see coming out, we're not going to try and bore you with slides we were joking before we came on that it wouldn't be very exciting to look at words of contracts. John might differ, but I do think that we'll probably give you a flavour of the new form of contract in the presentation as follows. John might like to say a few words as well.
Yeah, look, I just wanted to thanks Colin and thanks Conor, and hello to everybody. It's a pity it's online and not face to face. I've never been to a CEEC conference, but I've certainly heard many reports, both from Conor and indeed from Jerry O'Sullivan over the years. So it's a pity I can't be there in person. I work for a builder, as Conor said. I come from a different point of view to Conor, which I think was very important in the formulation of the contract. Past president of the society, and also past president of the governing council, sorry, I beg your pardon, past member of the governing council of the RICS. I think, as my white hair suggests, I have over 30 years experience in the industry, so I've kind of seen quite a bit, and experienced, or rather suffered quite a bit at the industry. And I think really what we want to do is tell you a little bit about the background of, how we ended up where we ended up with the development of the contract, and some aspects of the contract without getting into too much detail, and try to identify some parts that maybe you might find a little bit different to what you might come across. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of construction contracts have very similar attributes right across Europe, but what we're going to try and do is pick out something at least that we think is a little bit different. Some of the delegates may well have come across it before in other forums. So over to you, Conor.
Yeah, I suppose how the background to this was in existence in Ireland about 14 years ago now, probably, were two forms of contracts that were mainly used. That was the private sector form and the public sector form. The one being for the Irish members, they know them as the RAI and the GDLA. But in essence, they followed each other almost line for line, bar when it went into public contracts that dealt with things like public ethics and so forth. Then in 2007, I won't swear on the year, 2000, a new form of contract was promoted by the government, which is the government form of contract, which changed the landscape, you could say. It almost it changed, it converted it passed the risk of all most of the risk to the contractor. Now, since then, that was the original form. Since then, there's been a number of other forms produced by the Government Contracts Committee, and most of them have a solid base, and but there are obviously objections from the contracting side to all the risk being passed to them, and I would be probably in agreement with that unnecessarily in some cases. It also, but the new form of contract also gave a sort of the new government form that back in 10 years ago gave a new sort of discipline to the contractor and how to inform the employer early on when variations arose, which was probably missing from the previous forms of contract. Anyway, we moved forward very fast to for 5 years. About 2013, would you believe it? I looked up the date this morning. I couldn't believe it. Kieran Fahey, who's an engineer, gave a speech to Engineers Ireland where he mooted the idea of whether the government form could be adopted for private use. And out of that sprung a group of 5 people, one from the SCSI, myself, one from the CIF, John, Kieran Fahey from Engineers Ireland, Anthony Hussey, who is a solicitor, and Kieran McIntyre from the Association of Consulting Engineers. These were the main sort of representative bodies of in the construction industry in Ireland. But they came together as individuals more than as representatives, because at that time there was and is a group of people called the Liaison Committee for the Construction Industry, which was on a much more formal basis. This was tasked with reviewing the private sector forms of contract, and I think to say that the snail and the tortoise, I think the snail won when it came to the liaison committee, and it's still winning. It's moved very, very slowly. It's not to say that it doesn't progress, and it's a great place for discussion, but product is not one of its main features. I think it would be fair to say. That might be unfair, and some people might consider it unfair.
Could I come in there, Conor? Yeah. I think the beauty about the group that was put together was that they weren't encumbered by their representative bodies. The liaison committee is a committee of bodies with representatives on it, and those representatives have to observe the interests of the bodies, and those bodies themselves have many constituent members, and the Construction Industry Federation is just that, a federation. And the ability to move forward for the liaison committee is burdened, I suppose, by the agendas, quite frankly, of the various committees, and as a result, things don't move fast, exactly as Conor has said. You know,
exactly.
And I think it created a vacuum in the industry, where on one hand we had seen the public works contract take off with a revised risk balance, and the private sector contract, you know, standing still effectively. And maybe I think that's an accurate view that the legal teams and investors would have. And that vacuum then was filled with huge numbers of alternative amendments to the standard private contract. And that standard private contract then, which had 38 clauses, that's the RIAI contract, Royal Institution of the Architects of Ireland. Those 38 clauses became very heavily amended. And, you know, in many times, in many parts, there were another 38 clauses added. And when you do so much carving and cutting of a contract, you do introduce a lot of uncertainty, at least in professionals' minds. And, you know, you do have drafting issues and drafting errors. And, you know, it did seem to lead to heightened difficulty in the industry. In effect, instead of from a contracting point of view, instead of getting on and building the building, you were darn well reading a contract when you'd rather be reading a specification.
Yeah, I agree. And I think out of that, the word standard form is that it doesn't become amended. And in essence, the government form was not amended because the government weren't amending it. There was amendments made, but standard means everybody has familiarity with it. And that brings us back to the point I made earlier, where that we had two forms of contract many years ago that were very similar in wording. People had a familiarity with it. People had an understanding of it. They didn't have to look at one contract and think, I wonder what the wording is in another. They were almost identical, bar the necessity for governments to have clauses regarding ethics, as I mentioned earlier. So part of the group that met decided that we would use the government form as the basis, and the government kindly allowed us to use the public works contract as the basis for the new form of contract that we were proposing. And fast forward from our initial meeting, I think in 2016 or 17, if you call it fast forward, we were ready to launch the document at the beginning of the year. Unfortunately, COVID intervened, so it was postponed until a couple of weeks ago. I've just given a little bit more background about how it was dealt with within the bodies. So when the group of five then met, we went back to the individual member organizations and said, look, this is a contract we would like you to support. They were already supportive. In the case of the surveyors body, the Society of Chartered Surveyors, we had a number of different groups that I had to meet, give you my personal view on it, and then John can give you the view of the CIF. But in terms of surveyors, we had the project managers professional group, the building surveyors professional group, and the quantity surveyors professional group. And within the quantity surveyors professional group, there was two subsections. There was the quantity surveyors group per se, and then there was the contractors subgroup. And we got feedback from them as what they wanted included and what they didn't like. As I've said many times, is that the project managers, who I would see as probably more client representative, thought it was unfair to them, and the contractors QSs thought it was unfair to them. So I thought we had the balance reasonably struck on that basis. Certain clauses were amended. I think the contractor side looked for limited liability on insurance, and that was accepted by the group. And mainly this, and then we got a great support from the society to push ahead. So much so that at one stage we were, depending on the other organisations who were deciding it, we were going to push ahead on a unilateral basis at one stage. But anyway, the group came together and agreed, and here we are now. John, you might give the CIF view.
From the contracting front, I guess because the public works contract had such a risk balance, the initial reaction from contractors was horrific. I certainly felt a lot of heat when I made a presentation to the CIF. They didn't understand why anybody who worked for a contractor could possibly consider utilizing the public works contract. So I got a terribly negative reaction. However, they eventually read the document, and whilst there were many aspects of it that were unpopular. There was eventually a realization that A, it wasn't as bad as the Public Works Forum, and B, it wasn't as bad as the many alternative amendments and difficulties that arise from the amendments to the current private sector contract. That's the RIAI form of contract. So after some discussions, eventually it was absorbed and accepted. But I do, Conor, I did get some pretty tetchy phone calls from senior personnel in the industry, but they were, at the time, it was a new document, they hadn't studied it, you know. So yeah. Thankfully we you know, it was accepted and is promoted now on all of our websites.
Yeah, I probably should, or we probably should point out there was one gap in the people who are who arranged to agree the contract, is that the architects were reluctant to join in on the basis that the current private sector contract used in Ireland is the RAI form, and that is an architect's form, and they didn't see the need for an alternative form, even though the architect's form is, as John said, mutilated by the solicitors now because it hasn't changed in 20 years, 25 years. It hasn't caught up at the times. Like there's no clauses dealing with BIM or like adjudication or anything like so. So it needs radical surgery, and as I understand it, that's ongoing. So this document was agreed by the engineers and the quantity surveyors, I suppose, in and the contracting side, but the architects are not involved. One of the benefits of the contract, if I may just start going into a little bit of detail, is, and I think John said is that it allows the employer's representative or the contract administrator to be any person, I suppose, so as opposed to just naming the architect or naming an engineer. So that suited the building surveyors and it suited project managers as well. So they didn't have to amend the contract, that their current contracts, which state that, you know, the engineer shall do this or the architect shall do this. The project manager or the contract administrator can be almost anybody, I suppose, for want of a better word, and so it's generic to any profession or occupation.
We'll start getting into some of the things we like.
I think so.
Yeah. Will I kick off, Conor?
You kick off, John. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think I have a few notes here, and I'll zip through them as quickly as I can. Some things that I think are a little bit novel, a little bit different, and why we think it'll work effectively. As Conor said earlier on, it follows the same format, almost restores the balance pre-2007 to the idea that there's essentially one form of contract in use, so that people who are building buildings can actually just do that. Focus on safety, focus on quality, focus on program, and deliver an employer's building without having to figure out whether they've got to write another darn letter rather than get on with the job. And that's going to be so important for the industry if the industry takes it up. There's a series at the back. Now, this is not peculiar to the the private sector. It's in the public sector, but it is a novel part of the public sector and therefore the private sector. And that is there's a schedule at the back. I'd nearly compare it to an Excel spreadsheet that lays out compensation events and delay events. And in essence, you have your event, and to the right of that event, it tells you whether you're entitled to time and money, or indeed time or money. And it's, in essence, if it ain't on the list, you ain't getting it, I suppose, to use a vernacular phrase. And again, nice and clear, cuts down on confusion, cuts down on the amount of debate and the what ifs scenarios. And I think that's going to prove very, very popular. Now, whilst it, you know, the language that's used in it is modern language. It's easy to get a hold of. It's easy for people who don't have training in the contract to get into it very, very, very quickly. Now that's the beauty of the public sector contract, and that's why the private sector contract, we thought another reason to follow it. And again, it'll be quick and easy to get into it. It does have an increased risk profile for the contractor. That's an inevitability given the times we live in, the way projects are funded, the drive towards final cost certainty at an earlier stage. As a result of that, and the increased risk profile and the increased demand it places on contractors' administration, we do hope that it won't be amended by the legal professions. Now, you know, maybe that's a bit naive on my part, but then, you know, if it does need to be amended by a legal professional, well, maybe it doesn't quite need 38 clauses to be amended and another 38 clauses to be added. So to the extent there are amendments, we certainly hope that they would be fewer amendments, and that mightn't prove popular with lawyers, unfortunately, but look, there's always a victim somewhere. But you know, hopefully that'll reduce amendments. The contract, our concept was that let's make it more collaborative. Let's try and take the sting out of the industry that started to develop since the Public Works Forum came in. And so, quite apart from the fact that there is a time bar on contractors, if a contractor doesn't get his notifications in on time, he is time barred. And you know, much and all as I think that's wrong, it's part and parcel. And you know, the legal concept goes back to the 1860s, so it's not anything new, and I don't think it's ever going to change. So look, we just have to suck that up and get on with it as contractors. But a couple of things about that. You know, when the employer's representative receives the notification, he has to respond, but he has to consult with the contractor and the employer and try and get agreement by both of them in that response. And so that when he writes his determination, hopefully it will be agreed. Now, to the extent it's not agreed, he's got to go off and make his determination. And there's another point on that. If the employer's rep does not make his determination on time, the contractor's submission will be deemed to have been accepted. And that's really important, because what it does is it turns the pressure back. It says, right, you're going to require me to give you notification within a fixed period of time. The least you could do is respond in time. And whilst we don't foresee situations whereby contractor submissions will be accepted by default, it will cause a meaningful response to have been delivered. And we think that hopefully will be worthwhile, and it will prove important for people. As Conor said, there is a limitation on liability. It's the first time that there is a limitation on liability in an Irish standard contract. It is an optional clause. It's set at 100% of the contract sum, which may be uncomfortable for some contractors, but it is nevertheless the first time it's come in, and I think it's worthy of consideration by people. Cost savings, there's a cost savings clause in it. Value engineering sometimes is the phrase used, but it is really cost saving, and there's a 50-50 sharing on that between the parties. As regards to the appointment of specialist subcontractors, there are 3 ways for an employer to bring his influence to bear, and in our opinion are giving the employer maximum flexibility. They're all optional, doesn't have to use any of them, but there is an option to use a nominated subcontractor, where the employer tells the contractor who to employ. A novation arrangement, where the employer engages a third-party contractor and then novates the entirety of the contract to the contractor. And indeed, the naming of specialists, causing the contractor to go off and enter an agreement with that specialist. There are varying degrees of risks and responsibilities depending on which option an employer chooses to use on any given specialist package, but they have maximum flexibility. So the employer can do either or indeed a mixture of all of them. Dispute resolution is negotiation, conciliation, and arbitration. The parties can choose adjudication at any stage, and that's a statutory right in Ireland since 2016. The negotiation again follows on from the old discussion that we would hope would ensue prior to an employer's determination. Conciliation is kind of follows a mediation up front, but if the parties don't agree with a formal mediator, that mediation turns into a conciliation, and the conciliator is compelled to issue a recommendation. That recommendation has to be based on the rights and obligations of the parties. It's not a traditional mediation type settlement, and the losing party, to use that phrase, they're compelled to pay the recommendation, even if they reject the recommendation, until such time as they move things on to adjudication or indeed arbitration. And that's very interesting. There is a requirement that the receiving party, the person who is successful, that they produce a bond for 50% of the value of the recommendation, not 100%, 50%. There's a difficulty with getting on-demand bonds here in Ireland. They're quite difficult to get, and so as a result, we set it at 50% rather than 100%. You essentially have to lodge the money to a bonder to get an on-demand bond in Ireland. So the value of receiving the money with a 100% bond is diminished as a result. The adjudication process is there, as I said. The arbitration process obviously has come into disrepute in Ireland over the last number of years, mainly I think because of the cost and the duration. But the arbitration procedure in the contract is a 100-day arbitration procedure. So it's very, very quick in relative terms. And I think it is more suitable for a dispute rather than a dispute that involves an adjudication at 28 days. Connor, I'm grabbing the limelight there. I'm gassing on. Do you want to jump in there?
No, I thought I heard a train coming for you at one stage there.
I sorry, one other point I forgot to say. Oh, and by the way, it's free.
Yeah, that is actually a good point to make. It's on the SCSI website, as it is on the CIF website as well, and it's an open document, so you don't have to pay for it. And how it will be managed, I suppose I probably should just before we forget about it, going forward, there's a standing committee has been appointed by the organisations which will cover amendments and so forth. We haven't met yet because nobody has suggested amendment, but I think we're going to probably suggest amendments to ourselves because I see a question coming up there about COVID, that type of thing. So we need to move forward with modernize it rather than and keep it modern. I think that's important. Just a few points from my point of view. The title, I think, says it all to me of what the contract of this section of the conference. It's the balancing risk with greater certainty of cost, and that's what I like about the contract. We get a rebalancing of the risk, which John and I have touched on earlier, where the party best able to take the risk takes the risk, and we get a greater certainty of cost than we do at present with private sector contracts. For example, the original form of contract, the government form, was based on a full design by the design team. I'd hazard a guess, and I might be, but I don't think that's happened ever, and I don't think it's going to happen because I don't think it's a possibility. Maybe I'm incorrect. But to get the design team now to have the design done lock, stock and barrel before you commence, I think is probably at this stage impossible. It used to be the case that but for some reason, I think due to the fracturing of the subcontracting and so forth, I think it's more difficult, and the design elements, you know, like fire safety and services and facade designing and so forth. So one of the big problems with the government form, which is that, you know, you can't provide provision PC sum, what we call PC sums. In other words, everything has to be measured and value and described in the tender documents and priced by the contractor. In this document, we can bring in what our subcontractors. So the design team can go to a window designer and say, give me a price. Go to 5 of them, give me a price, and novate that contractor or appoint him to the contract. So that's going back to sort of the old the old private sector form of contract, and is nothing. It would speed up the delivery of contracts, as opposed to the government form, which I think delays delivery because of the necessity to have it fully designed. I hope that's reasonably clear. John mentions points about, you know, the benefit of the discipline, which I like about the contract, is it imposes on the contractor the same obligations, albeit slightly watered down, as in the government form, in that they must report variations in time and get approval for them. So there's no ambush at the end of the contract or towards the end. The employer is aware all the way through or should be aware all the way through the process of what costs are the final cost will be. One of the changes to the form is is in terms of measurement, and there was a feeling that and we changed clause 10.2, if you want to have a look at it in your own time, where the quantities are remeasured, and the contractor must claim those quantities within 42 days, which is, I hope my maths is right, 6 weeks, 6, 7, 4, yes, that's right, 6 weeks, because he would have when he knows of the quantities have changed. For example, earthworks or stone filling or something like that. If the quantity has changed, he should inform the employer within 6 weeks. So the costs can be reported to the employer, or any increase in costs can be reported to the employer. That doesn't apply to the client side, on the basis that they don't have the knowledge that the contractor would have in terms of, as I said, for example, excavation or filling. I'm presently dealing with a contract right now where that situation applies, in that because we've hit soft ground, so early reporting will help the certainty of cost, or the certainty of cost outcome. Other clauses are changed slightly, are substantial completion. It's been, not all documents have to be provided by the contractor, just those sufficient to allow the property to be used for its intended purposes. The other, let's see if I have we've, as I said, we've balanced the risk. The idea of ground conditions and so forth. There's a more rebalancing of risk dependent on trial pits and so forth. What other ones? Limitation of liability. There's a BIM protocol. There's liquidated damages. There's changes to that clause from the government form in terms of certification of liability by the employer's representative. And as John has alluded there, some of the notice details have changed and big one from his point of view, as he mentioned, was from the contractor's point of view, is that it's not the variation if it's not, or a clause 10.3 claim if it's not approved by the employer's representative, is deemed to be included now, as opposed to excluded under the or approved or disapproved under the government form. There are subtle changes throughout. There are, but not significant. And I go back to the point I made at the very beginning. It gives the user of the document and particularly new surveyors or new architects or new engineers, familiarity, because I think part of the problem is now, when I started off, and it was unfortunately before John, I think, but we sort of knew very quickly what the contracts were because the clauses were the same between the different forms. Now, I notice that young surveyors don't have the same familiarity, and I think this will help bring it back in. So I suppose for those watching from Ireland, we'd encourage you to use it. From those watching abroad, we'd welcome any suggestions that you might have to improve it. And from we're hoping that it will get taken up. It's only launched 2 or 3 weeks, so I haven't heard any feedback. I do agree with John. I hope that the legal firms don't start mutilating it. But other than that, I think that there is a question there. I might just jump in, or maybe I see a question coming in that regards how is COVID-19 dealt with on a compensation event, and that is a bit of a minefield, all right. But I think, like, I quickly looked up, it falls really under one of the compensation events which we have in the schedule, which is that particularly now that the government have locked down, although they haven't locked down the construction industry, so that doesn't make sense actually. It says that under clause event 15, delay to the works caused by an order or other act or court or of a public authority exercising authority under law, and it goes on. So, and that's done as a delay event and a compensation event. So that would be one version of events. I might apply other clauses to protect myself a little bit better, but John, you might have a view on that.
Yeah, I do, obviously, and I saw the question coming in there, Connor. Like, obviously, force majeure is, unlike in some European countries, force majeure is not anything other than a creature of contract in Ireland. So the concept of a superior force doesn't exist in Ireland in common law. It only ever exists if it's introduced into a contract. Now it's not actually in the contract. I think, in my mind, there is a gap in the contract that probably needs to be looked at, because it will only currently react if the government issue an order by way of response to a force majeure event, not the force majeure event itself. So I do think it needs to be looked at. I think there's a gap there in the contract, and you know, even the use of the phrase force majeure in of itself, the RAI form just uses it but doesn't define it, and it seems to be acceptable in the courts, notwithstanding it's only 2 words and not defined. Other forms do define it, and of course in Europe, I believe, but I don't know, but I believe it's almost, I appreciate common law is the wrong expression to use, but it's a recognized concept in Europe outside a contract.
Yeah, I think, like, I think my view on COVID, like, it is unprecedented, and I think, you know, the government have dealt with it on a reasonable basis, and I think most private sector clients that I know have dealt with it on a reasonable basis, as have most contractors. Yeah, and I emphasize the word most, because not all, because it's on both sides. So I think if you're arguing contract for COVID-19, we're probably in the wrong. You're in the wrong position.
Yeah. But obviously, COVID-19 is a force majeure event that's at one end of the scale, you know, and there are lots of other force majeure events that don't have quite the same impact.
Yeah.
Think about, you know.
Exactly.
Yeah. Gents, that was an excellent presentation, and thank you very much for your time and you know, great knowledge in terms of the contract amendments that you've put forward. I'd just like to echo both John and Connor's point that the alternative contract is on the SCSI website, and again, I would encourage all members to download that and have a look at it and see is it something that they can work with in terms of their own projects. Just in the context of it being an alternative contract and the name alternative, is there any kind of jarring there with the RII? I know you touched on it earlier on, Conor, I think when you said that the architects are not particularly behind this one, but and you've given your points across as to why the alternative contract might be more amenable or appropriate to use in certain situations. But is that going to cause confusion in the market, do you think, is having an alternative contract there, or is there an alignment that may come in due course?
I'll take it. I personally don't think it's going to be cause confusion in the market. I think the RII it is what it is. We're not calling it the alternative contract, but it is an alternative.
Sure.
And at the moment, the RII is so heavily amended, you know, that there are multiple alternatives. Each solicitor's office has an alternative RII form of contract. So I understand the RII are together with, let me not just say, the RII together with the liaison committee on which this SCS Society Chartered Surveyors sit and the CIF sit, they are almost ready, I think, to produce a revised document. Now, it's a little bit delayed, I think, because of COVID, but I think that there's a new form of contract coming out, and I've seen some drafts of it. I don't think I've seen the most recent one, or I haven't read it. But I think that you know, there's no harm in the RII alternative contract being available. So yeah, I think that I think the nice thing about this is there's familiarity with the government form, which I think you know is and I think I like as I said earlier, the discipline of reporting.
Yeah, John, I don't know, are you going to jump in there and have it?
Yeah, I think it, you know, because what we had was 5 or 6 professionals who went off and did their own thing and then presented it to the respective bodies. We weren't burdened, and look, I don't want to harp on too much about that, but I think what the CIF have accepted here, they would have difficulty accepting within the liaison committee. Now, what this now does is it does move the bar in terms of what is now acceptable to the CIF. So you know, it's going to be difficult for the CIF to sit either at a conference with the Government Construction Contracts Committee, or indeed the RII, and say conditions precedent are not acceptable, because they have accepted them now in this form. So hopefully it will encourage the RII and the liaison committee to move a little bit on the RII form, and so whilst maybe it might appear as though it jars, I think maybe it will hopefully provide the impetus for change there as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point, I think. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly check to see the chat function to see if there is any more questions, and if there's not, we may start to bring proceedings to an end. I started off the conference this morning saying my job is to keep an eye on time, and I see we're just a minute over 12:30, so I want to try and bring it to keep my promise and my end of the bargain. So I think that's pretty much it in terms of questions. So just a particular thanks to John and Conor there with respect to the presentation. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Just in terms of our overall contributors to this morning's presentation and session, I'd obviously like to thank, as I say, Conor and John, Dr. Tim de Jong, Dr. Dermot Keeley, and at the start Charles Mitchell and Stephen Lynham. I'd just like to express a very warm thank you to both Michelle and Patrick back in the SCSI, obviously working through unprecedented times in the context of trying to pull together these conferences, and I don't think we would have gotten through this morning as smoothly as we did without their input. So just on behalf of the organisation team and the presenters, thank you very much to both Patrick and Michelle. I'm going to invite Jerry O'Sullivan back in now, just to help with the conclusion part of this session. So I'll invite Jerry in to say a few words now, if I may.
Thank you very much, Colin. I suppose in a sense, I hope that this morning's sessions have been useful to you in your own profession as a construction economist, to give you a broad view of where we think we should be going and the sort of matters which need to be addressing. I think it's quite clear that one of the most important things is that we get consistency in how we report and how we deal with things. And I suppose it was drawn a common thread through everything. We've got a lot of work to do and skill sets to get on board, and of course data collection to do to make those skill sets work over the next couple of years. I mean, the cost reporting system under ICMS, the government, you can clearly see the government are buying into that. They're buying into life cycle costing, and that's why ICMS is working for them. And you can bet your bottom dollar the Green Party in government and the Green Agenda that carbon counting is going to be part and parcel of the agenda. And yes, it's at its early stages, but these are opportunities for our companies and our firms and our expertise to get up to speed on these things. If we have the data collection process frameworks in place, clearly the next step is, once they are in place, is to collect the data. As Tim says, this is about talking to each other and be prepared to share that data, because without the sharing of data, you can have all the frameworks and reporting systems you like, but if the data isn't good data, then it's no good to us. But the second part of the issue is consistency. And this is why it's important to remember that what the SCSI and the other groups are trying to do with the contracts we're putting together is to get a consistent contract. We did have that, as Connor said, 10, 15, 20 years ago in the industry here. We had two sets of contracts working in the industry, which everybody knew and understood and talked to each other. i.e. the wording was the same, the clauses were the same process. Now, it's quite correct to say that by the 1990s and the new commercial reality in construction, those contracts were a little bit out of date, a little bit of not fit for purpose, particularly from a client point of view, that the balance had, in their view, gone completely over to the contracting side. And we need to get back into a situation where the client got more control. And remember, the client is the person who pays our fees at the end of the day. He's the one who pays the contractor's bills at the end of the day. He is ultimately in the public sector, the end user there, the client is the public themselves. So they need to see professionals give value for money. And I think this is part of what we're trying to get across here, is that there's a whole skill set we need to have going forward to be able to give that value. If we're going to be cost valuers and cost advisors, it's not just about the capital cost. It's not about simple things. We need to upskill ourselves to be able to give that advice. We need contracts that are fit for purpose. And the reason why, let's be clear, government invested huge sums in putting together the public works contracts. They are, yes, people complain about them because the risk transfer, but remember, the document they produced was a very flexible document. You could transfer the whole risk to the contractor or a limited risk. That's how it works. It's a very sensible approach. The problem is sometimes people who use them don't use sensible approaches. There actually is very little wrong with the PwC contract if you read it carefully. And that's why SCSI and the Engineers Ireland all took the view that this is a proper management type contract. And we hope my colleagues from Europe and everything else looking at this will, I suppose, in the sense that you can log in and download and look at these contracts and see how they're used. They're not just Irish contracts, they could be used anywhere. They actually deal with, as I say, the reality of construction. So I concluded that. I think we've had enough, we're running over a little bit over time. Again, I thank all my colleagues from Europe who've say logged in. I hope that this has been of some use, not too hopefully colloquial or local to your, that we're being international enough to give you an idea that there's something there for you to have. I hope our local members have got some use out of this. And again, I really want to talk Colin Cleary for the hard work he's done today and putting the whole thing, well, keeping us all on time and putting us all together. And Patrick and Michelle for the wonderful work they've done behind the scenes and getting it together. And all our speakers today, who I say have given very good presentations. And again, Agneta for her little presentation at the beginning on behalf of CBC. And have, as I say, again, apologies, we can't have you here. We'd have loved to have this a live presentation and everybody to get together, but maybe, as I say, another time. So I'll close it off with that and thank you all very much for today's presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Jerry, and thank you very much all the delegates. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.